The Sword and the Stone, Chapter 11. Robin smiled at the elder boy and patted him on the back, while the wart thought despairingly about his dog. Then the outlaw cleared his throat and began to speak again. "You are right about going there," he said, "but I ought to tell you the unpleasant part. Nobody can get into the castle chariot except a boy or girl." "Do you mean you can't get in?" "You could get in." "I suppose," explained the wart, when he had thought this over, "it is like the thing about unicorns." "Right. A unicorn is a magic animal, and only a maiden can catch it. Fairies are magic too, and only innocent people can enter their castles. That is why they take away people's children out of cradles." Kay and Wirt sat in silence for a moment. Then Kay said, "Well, I am game. It is my adventure after all." The wart said, "I want to go too. I'm fond of Cavall." Robin looked at Marian. "Very well," he said. "We won't make a fuss about it, but we will talk about plans. I think it is good of you two to go, without really knowing what you are in for, but it will not be so bad as you think." "We shall come with you," said Marian. "Our band will come with you to the castle. You will only have to do the going-in part at the end." "Yes, and the band will probably be attacked by that griffin of hers afterwards." "Is there a griffin?" "Indeed there is. The castle chariot is guarded by a fierce one, like a watchdog. We shall have to get past it on the way there, or it will give the alarm, and you won't be able to get in. It will be a terrific stalk." "We shall have to wait till night." The boys passed the morning pleasantly, getting accustomed to two of Maid Marian's bows. Robin had insisted on this. He said that no man could shoot with another's bow any more than he could cut with another's scythe. For their midday meal they had cold venison pâté, with mead, as did everybody else. The outlaws drifted in for the meal like a conjuring trick. At one moment there would be nobody at the edge of the clearing. At the next, half a dozen right inside it. Green or sunburned men, who had silently appeared out of the bracken or the trees. In the end, there were about 100 of them, eating merrily and laughing. They were not outlaws because they were murderers, or for any reason like that. They were Saxons, who had revolted against Uther Pendragon's conquest, and who refused to accept a foreign king. The fens and wild woods of England were alive with them. They were like soldiers of the resistance in later occupations. Their food was dished out from a leafy bower, where Marian and her attendants cooked. The partisans usually posted a sentry to take the tree messages, and slept during the afternoon, partly because so much of their hunting had to be done in the times when most workmen sleep, and partly because the wild beasts take a nap in the afternoon, and so should their hunters. This afternoon, however, Robin called the boys to a council. "Look," he said, "you had better know what we are going to do. My band of 100 will march with you toward King Morgan's castle in 4 parties. You two will be in Marian's party. When we get to an oak which was struck by lightning in the year of the great storm, we shall be within a mile of the Griffin Guard. We shall meet at a rendezvous there, and afterward we shall have to move like shadows. We must get past the Griffin without an alarm. If we do get past it, and if all goes well, we shall halt at the castle at a distance of about 400 yards. We can't come nearer because of the iron in our arrowheads, and from that moment you will have to go alone. Now, Kay and Wart, I must explain about iron. If our friends have really been captured by the good people, and if Queen Morgan the Fay is really the queen of them, we have one advantage on our side. None of the good people can bear the closeness of iron. The reason is that the oldest ones of all began in the days of flint, before iron was ever invented, and all their troubles have come from the new metal. The people who conquered them had steel swords, which is even better than iron, and that is how they succeeded in driving the old ones underground. This is the reason why we must keep away tonight, for fear of giving them the uncomfortable feeling. But you two, with an iron knife blade hidden close in your hands, will be safe from the queen so long as you do not let go of it. A couple of small knives will not give them the feeling without being shown. All you will have to do is to walk the last distance, keeping a good grip of your iron, enter the castle in safety, and make your way to the cell where the prisoners are. As soon as the prisoners are protected by your metal, they will be able to walk out with you. Do you understand this, Kay and Wart?" "Yes, please," they said. "We understand this perfectly." "There is one more thing. The most important is to hold your iron, but the next most important is not to eat. Anybody who eats in you-know-what stronghold has to stay there forever. So for all sake's sake, don't eat anything whatever inside the castle, however tempting it may look. Will you remember?" "We will." After the staff lecture, Robin went to give his orders to the men. He made them a long speech, explaining about the griffin and the stock and what the boys were going to do. When he had finished his speech, which was listened to in perfect silence, an odd thing happened. He began at the beginning and spoke it from start to finish in the same words. On finishing it for the second time, he said, "Now, captains." And the 100 men split into groups of 20, which went to different parts of the clearing and stood round Marian, Little John, Much, Scarlet, and Robin. From each of these groups a humming noise rose to the sky. "What on earth are they doing?" "Listen," said the wart. They were repeating the speech, word for word. Probably none of them could read or write, but they had learned to listen and remember. This was the way in which Robin kept touch with his night raiders, by knowing that each man knew by heart all that the leader himself knew, and why he was able to trust them, when necessary, each man to move by himself. When the men had repeated their instructions, and everyone was word perfect in the speech, there was an issue of war arrows, a dozen to each. These arrows had bigger heads, ground to razor sharpness, and they were heavily feathered in a square cut. There was a bow inspection, and 2 or 3 men were issued with new strings. Then all fell silent. "Now then," cried Robin cheerfully. He waved his arm, and the men, smiling, raised their bows in salute. Then there was a sigh, a rustle, a snap of one incautious twig, and the clearing of the giant lime tree was as empty as it had been before the days of man. "Come with me," said Marian, touching the boys on the shoulder. Behind them the bees hummed in the leaves. It was a long march. The artificial glades which led to the lime tree in the form of a cross were no longer of use after the first half hour. After that they had to make their way through the virgin forest as best they might. It would not have been so bad if they had been able to kick and slash their way, but they were supposed to move in silence. Marian showed them how to go sideways, one side after the other, how to stop at once when a bramble caught them, and take it patiently out, how to put their feet down sensitively, and roll their weight to that leg as soon as they were certain that no twig was under the foot, how to distinguish at a glance the places which gave most hope of an easy passage, and how a kind of rhythm in their movements would help them in spite of obstacles. Although there were 100 invisible men on every side of them, moving toward the same goal, they heard no sounds but their own. The boys had felt disgruntled at first, at being put in a woman's band. They would have preferred to have gone with Robin, and thought that being put under Marian was like being trusted to a governess. They soon found their mistake. She had objected to their coming, but now that their coming was ordered, she accepted them as companions. It was not easy to be a companion of hers. In the first place, it was impossible to keep up with her unless she waited for them, for she could move on all fours, or even wriggle like a snake almost as quickly as they could walk. And in the second place, she was an accomplished soldier, which they were not. She was a true wave, except for her long hair, which most of the female outlaws of those days used to clip. One of the bits of advice which she gave them before talking had to be stopped was this: aim high when you shoot in battle rather than low. A low arrow strikes the ground. A high one may kill in the second rank. "If I am made to get married," thought the wart, who had doubts on the subject, "I will marry a girl like this, a kind of golden vixen." As a matter of fact, though the boys did not know it, Marian could hoot like an owl by blowing into her fists, or whistle a shrill blast between tongue and teeth with the fingers in the corner of the mouth, could bring all the birds to her by imitating their calls, and understand much of their small language, such as when the tits exclaim that a hawk is coming, could hit the popinjay twice for 3 times of robins, and could turn cartwheels. But none of these accomplishments was necessary at the moment. The twilight fell mistily. It was the first of the autumn mists, and in the dimity the undispersed families of the tawny owl called to each other, the young with kiwick, and the old with the proper hooroo, hooroo. The noise called tu-wit, tu-woo, which is wished by poets on the owl, is really a family noise, made by separate birds. Proportionally, as the brambles and obstacles became harder to see, so did they become easier to feel. It was odd, but in the deepening silence the wart found himself able to move more silently, instead of less. Being reduced to touch and sound, He found himself in better sympathy with these, and could go quietly and quick. It was about Compline, or as we should call it, at 9 o'clock at night, and they had covered at least 7 miles of the toilsome forest, when Marian touched Kay on the shoulder and pointed into the blue darkness. They could see in the dark now, as well as human beings can see in it, and much better than townspeople will ever manage to. And there, in front of them, struck through 7 miles of trackless forest by Marian's woodcraft, was the smitten oak. They decided with one accord, without even a whisper, to creep up to it so silently that even the members of their own army, who might already be waiting there, would not know of their arrival. But a motionless man has the advantage of a man in motion, and they had hardly reached the outskirts of the roots when friendly hands took hold of them, patted their backs with pats as light as thistledown, and guided them to seats. The roots were crowded. It was like being a member of a band of starlings or of roosting rooks. In the night mystery, 100 men breathed on every side of Wart, like the surge of our own blood, which we can hear when we are writing or reading in the late and lonely hours. They were in the dark and stilly womb of night. Presently, the Wart noticed that the grasshoppers were creaking their shrill note, so tiny as to be almost extra audible, like the creak of the bat. They creaked one after another. They creaked, when Marian had creaked 3 times to account for Kay and Wart as well as for herself, 100 times. All the outlaws were present, and it was time to go. There was a rustle, as if the wind had moved in the last few leaves of the 900-year-old oak. Then an owl hooted softly, a field mouse screamed, a rabbit thumped, a dog fox barked his deep single lion's cough, and a bat twittered above their heads. The leaves rustled again, more lengthily, while you could count 100, and then Maid Marian, who had done the rabbit's thump, was surrounded by her band of 20 plus 2. The Wart felt a man on either side of him take his hand as they stood in a circle, and then he noticed that the stridulation of the grasshoppers had begun again. It was going round in a circle towards him, and, as the last grasshopper rubbed its legs together, the man on his right squeezed his hand. Wart stridulated. Instantly, the man on his left did the same, and pressed his hand also. There were 22 grasshoppers before Maid Marian's band was ready for its last stalk through the silence. The last stalk might have been a nightmare, but to the Wart it was heavenly. Suddenly he found himself filled with an exultation of night, and felt that he was bodiless, silent, transported. He felt that he could have walked upon a feeding rabbit, and caught her up by the ears, furry and kicking, before she knew of his presence. He felt that he could have run between the legs of the men on either side of him, or taken their bright daggers from their sheaths while they still moved on undreaming. The passion of nocturnal secrecy was a wine in his blood. He really was small and young enough to move as secretly as the warriors. Their age and weight made them lumber, in spite of all their woodcraft, and his youth and lightness made him mobile, in spite of his lack of it. It was an easy stalk, except for its danger. The bushes thinned, and the sounding bracken grew rarely in the swampy earth, so that they could move 3 times as fast. They went in a dream, unguided by owl's hoot or bat's squeak, but only kept together by the necessary pace which the sleeping forest imposed upon them. Some of them were fearful, some revengeful for their comrade, some, as it were, disbodied in the sleepwalk of their stealth. They had hardly crept for 20 minutes when Maid Marian paused in her tracks. She pointed to the left. Neither of the boys had read the book of Sir John de Mandeville, so they did not know that a griffin was 8 times larger than a lion. Now, looking to the left in silent gloom of night, they saw cut out against the sky and against the stars something which they never would have believed possible. It was a young male griffin in its first plumage. The front end, and down to the forelegs and shoulders, was like a huge falcon. The Persian beak, the long wings, in which the first primary was the longest, and the mighty talons, all were the same, but as Mandeville observed, the whole 8 times bigger than a lion. Behind the shoulders a change began to take place. Where an ordinary falcon or eagle would content itself with the 12 feathers of its tail, Falco leonis serpentis began to grow the leonine body and the hind legs of the beast of Africa, and after that a snake's tail. The boys saw, 24 feet high in the mysterious night light of the moon, and with its sleeping head bowed upon its breast so that the wicked beak lay on the breast feathers, an authentic griffin that was better worth seeing than 100 condors. They drew their breath through their teeth, and for the moment hurried secretly on, storing the majestic vision of terror in the chambers of remembrance. They were close to the castle at last, and it was time for the outlaws to halt. Their captain touched hands silently with Kay and Wart, and the two went forward through the thinning forest, towards a faint glow which gleamed behind the trees. They found themselves in a wide clearing or plain. They stood stock still with surprise at what they saw. It was a castle made entirely out of food, except that on the highest tower of all, a carrion crow was sitting, with an arrow in its beak. The oldest ones of all were gluttons. Probably it was because they seldom had enough to eat. You can read even nowadays a poem written by one of them, which is known as the Vision of Mac Conleen. In this vision, there is a description of a castle made out of different kinds of food. The English for part of the poem goes like this. A lake of new milk I beheld, in the midst of a fair plain. I saw a well-appointed house thatched with butter. Its 2 soft door-posts of custard, its days of curds and butter, beds of glorious lard, many shields of thin-pressed cheese. Under the straps of those shields were men of soft, sweet, smooth cheese, men who knew not to wound a gale, spears of old butter had each of them. A huge cauldron full of meat, methought I try to tackle it. Boiled leafy kale, browny white, a brimming vessel full of milk. A bacon house of 2 ribs, a waddling of tripe, support of clans, of every food pleasant to man, meseemed the whole was gathered there. Of chitterlings of pigs were made, its beautiful rafters, splendid the beams and the pillars of marvelous pork. The boys stood there in wonder and nausea before just such a stronghold. It rose from its lake of milk in a mystic light of its own, in a greasy, buttery glow. It was the fairy aspect of Castle Chariot, which the oldest ones, sensing the hidden knife blades after all, had thought would be tempting to the children. It was to tempt them to eat. The place smelt like a grocer's, a butcher's, a dairy, and a fishmonger's rolled into one. It was horrible beyond belief, sweet, sickly, and pungent, so that they did not feel the least wish to swallow a particle of it. The real temptation was to run away. However, there were prisoners to rescue. They plodded over the filthy drawbridge, a butter one, with cow hairs still in it, sinking to their ankles. They shuddered at the tripe and the chitterlings. They pointed their iron knives at the soldiers made of soft, sweet, smooth cheese, and the latter shrank away. In the end, they came to the inner chamber, where Morgan Le Fay herself lay stretched upon her bed of glorious lard. She was a fat, dowdy, middle-aged woman with black hair and a slight mustache, but she was made of human flesh. When she saw the knives, she kept her eyes shut, as if she were in a trance. Perhaps, when she was outside this very strange castle, or when she was not doing that kind of magic to tempt the appetite, she was able to assume more beautiful forms. The prisoners were tied to pillars of marvelous pork. "I am sorry if this iron is hurting you," said Kay, "but we have come to rescue our friends." Queen Morgan shuddered. "Will you tell your cheesy men to undo them?" She would not. "It is magic," said the wart. "Do you think we ought to go up and kiss her, or something frightful like that?" "Perhaps if we went and touched her with the iron." "You do it." "No, you." "We'll go together." So they joined hands to approach the queen. She began to writhe in her lard like a slug. She was in agony from the metal. At last, and just before they reached her, there was a sloshing rumble or mumble, and the whole fairy appearance of Castle Chariot melted together and collapsed, leaving the 5 humans and 1 dog standing together in the forest clearing, which still smelt faintly of dirty milk. "Gor blimey," said Friar Tuck. "Gor blimey and coo! Dash my vig if I didn't think we was done for." "Master!" said Dog Boy. Cavall contented himself with barking wildly, biting their toes, lying on his back, trying to wag his tail in that position, and generally behaving like an idiot. Old Wat touched his forelock. "Now then," said Kay, "this is my adventure, and we must get home quick."